What we have here is a flow chart that illustrates a set of rules called the sequence of tenses. The sequence of tenses in Latin dictates what type of subjunctive you will use when you have a sentence that contains a subordinate clause using a special use of the subjunctive. For example, in the sentence, I killed the king in order to save the people, you have two clauses. I killed the king is what we would call the main clause, and a main clause is a clause that works as a full sentence by itself. You could say, I killed the king, full stop, and that's a sentence. But you couldn't say, in order to save the people, by itself. That's not a full sentence alone. That's what we call a subordinate clause. And subordinate clauses in Latin oftentimes use the subjunctive. When they do, you have an option for what tense of the subjunctive you use, but the tense depends on the subordinate clause's relationship to the main clause. That's really quite a handful, so you can pause, rewind, and listen to that again, or proceed to some examples. In order to decide what type of subjunctive we use in a subordinate clause, we have to follow a series of steps. First, we have to figure out, is the main clause in what we call primary sequence, or is it in secondary sequence? If it's in primary sequence, the verb of that main clause will be in one of these tenses. It will be present, future, present perfect, or future perfect. Notice that all of these tenses express either present time or future time. That's called the primary sequence. If your main verb is in secondary sequence, it will be in a past tense, either imperfect, perfect, or pluperfect. Once you've decided if you're in primary sequence or secondary sequence, then you look at your subordinate clause. And you have to decide, is the verb in the subordinate clause expressing time that happens at the same time as the main verb, or is it happening in time before the main verb? And I actually call same time plus, because really the question is, does the action happen at the same time or after the main verb? Let's look at an example here. In this sentence, I kill the king in order to save the people. This is obviously an English sentence, but let's pretend for a second that it's in Latin. I kill the king in order to save the people. The first thing we would do is decide what sequence is our main verb in. The main verb is kill, because I kill the king is a complete clause, i.e. a main clause by itself. And that the verb kill is in the present tense. So we know we're in primary sequence. And then we look at our subordinate clause, which is in order to save the people. Now ask yourself, is that saving happening before you kill the king, at the same time as you kill the king, or after you kill the king? It's really happening after, so that would be same time plus. And so this verb to save, if we were in Latin here, would be in the present subjunctive, because we are in primary sequence, our main verb is in the present, and therefore we need the present subjunctive to express same time plus. Let's take another example. I killed the king in order to save the people. First, we look at our main verb, killed. What tense is that? It's past tense, right? In Latin, it would be perfect. And then, in order to save the people, does that saving happen before, during, after, or after the king is killed? Well, it happens after. It's same time plus. So if this verb to save was in Latin, now it would be in the imperfect subjunctive, because in our flow chart we've decided we're in secondary sequence, we have a verb in the perfect, It's happening same time plus, so we need the imperfect subjunctive. New scenario. I ask why you hated me for so long. Our main verb is ask. So is that primary sequence or secondary sequence? The verb ask is present tense. Now we go to our subordinate clause and we ask, is this verb expressing same time plus or time before the main verb? I asked why you hated me. You used to hate me, so that's expressing time before. So if we were in Latin here, this verb hated would be in the perfect subjunctive because we're in primary sequence, our main verb is in the present tense, and the subordinate clause is expressing time before. So we use the perfect subjunctive. Final example. I asked why you had hated me. Our main verb is in the past tense, probably a perfect. So we're in secondary sequence. Our verb in the subordinate clause is had hated. And that's something that happened before the thing that happened in the main clause. So we need time before. So if this was Latin, had hated would be in the pluperfect subjunctive here. It's a complicated chart. The best way to get used to using sequence of tenses is to practice examples, and that's what we'll do in our subsequent videos when we learn specific uses of the subjunctive in Latin.